Hi everybody, my name is Sam Pedro. Today I'm going to be talking about the book Jack, Straight from the Gut, which was written by Jack Welch. In today's video, I want to briefly summarize the book, share a few highlights and takeaways, and of course talk a lot about who Jack Welch was. And so if you don't know who Jack Welch was, he was the CEO of General Electric from 1981 through 2001 and was extremely successful. To give you a little example, the stock price of General Electric increased over 3,000% in the 20 years he was CEO, which is absolutely just crazy to think about. Not only was he extremely successful, but he was also one of the most visible CEOs. He was always giving interviews. He was one of the most respected and well-known CEOs in the country during the 80s and the 90s. And Forbes magazine even listed him as the manager of the century. He has been met with some criticism now. It's been about 20 years since he stepped down as CEO of General Electric, and he even said when he was retiring that his legacy will be remembered by how well General Electric does for the next 20 years. And unfortunately, it peaked at the very end of Jack Welch's tenure as CEO, and General Electric has been kind of on a steady decline, if not a year-by-year plateau in the last 20 years. And so kind of interesting to look back at the book now, knowing that this thing he tried to build and hand off has actually struggled. The book itself was published in 2001 and is a very standard autobiography. It kind of tells Jack Welch's rags to riches story. The book begins with his early life. So he grew up in a working class family just outside of Boston in Salem. And he talks and describes his mother as a strong Irish Catholic woman who instilled in him just tremendous values that carried him through the rest of his life. He worked hard from the very beginning of his life. He was extremely driven and ambitious and just had so much energy. And like a lot of famous people, he funneled that energy and drive into his work. And so that was kind of the beginning of his life. He was just a hard worker. He went to college. He ended up getting a PhD. And after college, his first job out of college was with General Electric. The next part of the book talks about the 20 years before he became the CEO of General Electric, and just talking about kind of his rise up the corporate ladder, what those looked like. He started basically at the bottom and was able to quickly work his way up. He made a name for himself. He stood out, and he talks about some thoughts and ideas that went into helping him get noticed and what he did with the opportunities that were given to him. The next part of the book talks about his 20 years as CEO of General Electric and just talks about the key highlights and key deals that he made as CEO of GE. And one thing it really focuses on is the people aspect, and he just talks about how GE is built on great people. And so his goal as the leader of this huge global organization was to put an organizational structure in that would find great talent, that would build these people up, and that these great people would eventually go and build these great products. Another highlight that I kind of found interesting, I didn't know this, but General Electric was the parent company of NBC in the 90s. And NBC was in the 90s was probably one of the best television channels out there. Its flagship program was Seinfeld, and so he talks about working with Jerry Seinfeld and trying to negotiate with him and continue Seinfeld. And he just talks about conversations which he had, and I just found it really interesting. Another major theme from the book, and he spends a lot of time talking about it, is going through the process of choosing his successor. He, as I mentioned at the beginning, he felt his legacy would be remembered by putting General Electric in great hands. And so he goes into a lot of depth about the potential candidates, what he did to kind of narrow down who the next CEO should be. And that plays a big part of this book. That's the summary of the book. Now I want to talk about a few highlights and some things I learned. I want to start off by saying that I've read this book twice. The first time I read it, I had just recently graduated from my master's program and had just begun my career. And so reading about Jack Welch and kind of his rise in corporate America up the corporate ladder was really inspiring to me. And in many ways, one of my career goals is I want to be a leader. I want to be able to maybe one day even run an organization. And so reading about someone who was driven that way as well was extremely motivating and inspiring to me. With that idea, I really liked the leadership principles which he teaches in this book. When Jack Welch was CEO of GE, there were over 300,000 employees. So this was leadership and management on a colossal scale. So reading about, someone who's leading at the very top and looking down and the things he did, I just found that fascinating. I have read a little criticism of the book, and I'll share that now. Some people found the book to be a little boring. Others kind of felt like he didn't really share anything new. And what they meant by that is that a lot of the things he's talking about was public knowledge about these big deals that he did as CEO of GE. And I mean, I was born in the 90s, and so I wasn't reading the Wall Street Journal in the 90s. So I wasn't that familiar with a lot of, like, for example, NBC and other big corporations that they took over, or parts of their businesses they liquidated. So reading the book 20 years after it was written and 40 years after he began his start as CEO, I found it really interesting to learn more about General Electric, because I didn't really know that much about it. I think it played a very big role in American corporate history. So reading about those big mergers and acquisitions was really, I think, beneficial for me to read. As far as his legacy is concerned, it was definitely something interesting to think about. So I forgot to mention this, but Jack Welch passed away earlier this year. So he passed away in March of 2020. And it brought to mind, my thoughts about reading this book, and that I liked it and the things I learned. But it is interesting to think of his legacy, and if what he did or didn't do put General Electric in a better position or a worse position. At the end of the day, General Electric is still almost making $100 billion a year in revenue. And so it's still a huge company. It's still really successful. I think there's, last I checked, somewhere 200,000 employees, maybe a little bit more than that. And so yeah, I wonder if his legacy really is tarnished because it hasn't grown as much. As far as my own opinion, is this book tarnished somehow because GE hasn't lived up to the expectations when it was published? I don't think so. I still think there's a lot of gems and things to learn about this. I think anytime there's a personality like Jack Welch, someone who was described as manager of the century, I think it's worth looking at his thoughts and his background and the things he did. So I think there's a lot of value, even here in 2020, to go and read Jack straight from the gut. And so that's my summary and my review. Hopefully you found this video to be interesting and maybe even sway you to read it or maybe not read it. Please comment below if you have read it and what your thoughts are. Do you think his legacy is tarnished because the company hasn't done as well? Or do you think a book can stand on its own and still have leadership principles and things you can learn from the book? So yeah, if you liked today's video, please like and hit the subscribe button, and I will see you in the next video.